Hey guys, welcome to Chapter 3, Section 1, and we're going to get back into doing some Rails stuff. Chapter 2 was a bit of a break, so we could learn the basics of the Ruby programming language. This section is going to be all about the Rails framework. It's going to be about MVC, Model View Controller, a bit, and also we're going to go over the folder structure and why the Rails framework, why people use it, and why it's a great framework. So here are the traits that stick out when we talk about Ruby on Rails. First, it's an open source framework. It's completely open source and under a license, under a liberal free as in free license, so you'll never have to buy Ruby on Rails. Now you can buy support and help and add-ons and stuff like that, but you won't have to pay for the core framework. And Rails is a full stack framework, and what that means is that just about everything that you need to start creating applications comes in the box. Rails makes it so you don't have to install any other dependencies or libraries to make it work. And the different layers of the framework fit together seamlessly. There's other frameworks that will have you set up loads of configuration files, set up your routing and dispatch functions, and a whole bunch of other crap that's not really related to building the actual app and what the product you actually want to create. All the file structures there, you saw it in Chapter 1. We just easily created a new app, and it created tons of folders for us and tons of functionality that is just taken care of for us. So that makes Rails really easy to work with, and just it was built for productivity. And Rails it's cross-platform, and what that means is that it's platform independent, so it'll run on all browsers, it'll run on multiple servers and environments, it'll run on Apache. You can run it on basically anything if you just configure the server correctly. But I would suggest, if you're going to write Rails apps, I would suggest using Heroku. Just use it as your host. It's very easy to deploy an app. You saw how we did it in Chapter 1, so I would definitely suggest deploying with Heroku. Data abstraction. So data abstraction, I can't talk today. It allows us to interact with the database, whether it's Postgres like we're using, or MySQL or SQLite. We can interact with those databases without having to do the low-level SQL work. The models, other model view controller frameworks like, say, CodeIgniter or some other PHP framework, from experience, the models can get really cluttered and really just confusing, and that's one of my favorite things about Rails, is that it does that stuff for you. And it supports full active record functionality, so we can get and put things into the database very easily with Rails. Object oriented, obviously we've gone over that. Everything is an object in Rails, everything from strings to numbers to even comparison operators like and or, those are even considered objects in Rails. You can perform methods on any object, but we went through that. Same goes for Ruby, obviously. That's what we're talking about when we talk about objects in Rails. We're actually talking about Ruby. And Ruby on Rails is opinionated software, and that's a fairly new term, and it means that the software or the system, talking about Rails, kind of but guides developers into doing the right way of doing things, of programming, of making web apps. There's a certain path or approach that a developer should take when dealing with Rails, and you don't have to. If you're a good enough developer, you can change things around, you can change the structure around, but if you are looking to do that, then Rails probably isn't for you, because it's definitely there's definitely certain ways that you should do things, and it doesn't really make sense to do them a different way if you're using Rails. And I'd say unopinionated. I'm having a real tough time talking tonight. Unopinionated software, like say PHP, for example, will leave the developer. The developer has more freedom of what they want to do, but it also isn't as productive and isn't as fast. So, and isn't as fun either. So, yeah. And convention over configuration, I briefly went over in chapter 1 and 2, I believe. And what that means basically is that there's specific conventions that we use when generating or creating files and directories to create controllers and models. For instance, a controller should be plural. If you're going to have a posts controller, it should be posts. And if you're going to have the model, it should be post. It should be singular. So things like that. Convention over configuration, which would be just frameworks that have loads and loads of configuration files to go through and change and so forth. So this is an overview of a standard Rails app file structure, and I'll go over it briefly. The R app right here, this is just our apps folder. The one we created was called My Ruby Blog, and we have all these folders in it. The app folder is the main directory that we'll be working in. It holds the entire MVC structure, controllers, models, views, and helpers. The controllers folder, it holds all the controller classes. A controller handles HTTP requests from the browser, and it also interacts with the model. It gets data from the model, and then it will render a view. It'll use the data from the model and the view to display it to the user. The helpers folder does just that. They help the controller and keep it uncluttered and just keep it tidy. Just random functions, methods, and stuff like that. The models is obviously where we deal with the database. It holds all the database classes. In other frameworks, this folder can get really messy, like I said earlier, but Rails keeps it nice and neat for us and easy to interact with. Views are just presentation files, usually HTML files that will be displayed to the user on the website. The layouts folder is also in the view folder, which is template files for layouts that are to be used with views. So this is where you would keep like your header or your footer and stuff. You're not going to include your header in every view, so you would have that in a layout. It's like a template basically. So that's it for the app directory. And then we have components, which just holds components, which they're usually small self-contained apps that will bundle the model, view, and controller. Config. Rails luckily doesn't have a lot of config files compared to other frameworks, but the ones that it does have is located here, and the one that you're probably going to use the most when creating a Rails app is the routes, the routes.rb configuration file, and that's where you can just change around your home page, what view you want to use for your home page, and if you want to change the URL to certain controllers. And then there's the database.yml file, where you can specify the database you want to use for testing, development, and production. There's also an environment configuration file where you can configure the test, development, and production environments. DB is where all our database migrations will go, and it allows us to manage a relational database with scripts that you can generate or create. The doc folder is for documentation. Ruby uses something called Ruby Doc. It's used to generate documentation for your code. It'll generate it automatically, and this folder includes all the Ruby Doc generated Rails and application documentation. Let's see, lib is for our libraries, all our library classes. Logs is for our error logs and other kinds of logs. Public is the folder that is available to the web. This is where you would put your JavaScript files, your CSS, your images folder, and you could also have static HTML pages here. If you didn't want to use a dynamic view for your home page, you could actually just put an index.html file in this folder, and that's what it'll show for your home page. Scripts holds just that, scripts, and you can manage various tools that you can use with Rails. For instance, the generate command that we use to generate files. That's a script, and that's where that is kept. The test folder is, you can do mocks, unit testing, fixtures. We'll go over that in future sections. Temporary files is all the temporary files that are held for intermediate processing. Vendors is for third-party libraries. And then you just have the README file, just holds basic details about a Rails application. And then the rake file is similar to the Unix make file. It helps with building and packaging and testing the application. So that's the long, boring file and folder structure. As we go along, you'll get more familiar with them and know what does what. So here is, there's a lot of different workflows you can use for Rails. This one varies from what we've been doing, but I'll go through this workflow. This is very common. Use the Rails command to create the basic skeleton. So that's just the Rails new application like we did in Chapter 1. Actually, this isn't much different than what we did. Then we created a database. We did that in Chapter 1. We created the Postgres database, and we configured the database config file. And let's see, configure the application to know where your database is located, and the login credentials. That would be the database.yml configuration file. Create Rails active records or models, because they are the business objects you'll be working on in your controllers. So we'll be doing that this chapter, I believe. Database migrations. It allows for easy interacting with the database, and then we would write the controller code, which we'll be doing either in this chapter or the next. We're going to create a post controller, a users controller, probably some other ones, a page controller, and then we would create the views to present to the users of our website. So we would create the dynamic HTML files, which will hold HTML and will convert data from the model into HTML. So that's it for this section, and we went over the Rails app framework and file structure. Not too exciting, but it's just stuff. It's core knowledge that you need to have if you're gonna really get into programming Rails applications. So now we'll get into. I'm not exactly sure what we're gonna do next. Either more MVC explanation, or we'll just get right into the programming. I'll see you in the next video.